So today we continue to work in my workbook called Paul from Preacher to Prisoner, which covers Acts 18:23 to 23:24. Looking at the table of contents, we have completed the first 9 chapters, and this covers his third missionary journey. And then he travels back to Jerusalem, where he's arrested in Jerusalem. At 9, he spoke to the crowd that caused him to be arrested. And so now we're going to be in front of the Sanhedrin. So let's see if we can get to that. Paul before the Sanhedrin, Acts 23, 1 through 11.
Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience of this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth.
Because we can't hear the inflection of the voice in this chapter, we can't tell how Paul says the words he does. Therefore, you will decide what you think he means. Paul started his defense with 2 words. What's he start with?
My brothers.
This is not a normal start of a defense in front of the Sanhedrin. Normally, it'd be something like rulers of the people and elders of the council. So we already kind of made a mistake there.
Mm-hmm.
His words tend to indicate equal footing with the council rather than seeing them in superior positions. Paul was, at one time, a Pharisee and perhaps on the Sanhedrin over 20 years prior. Do you think it was a sense of being in a familiar place that caused him to start this way, or for another reason?
He felt the brotherhood with them.
Right. He felt like they were comrades, which they no longer are. Looking at what Paul said and the reaction of the high priest, did Paul say what he did sarcastically or as a start of his defense?
His defense.
Right. Yeah, he didn't say it sarcastically, but he didn't start off with the right footing there at all. We will hear about Ananias as high priest on the next page. Did the high priest strike Paul, or did he have someone else do it?
Someone struck him.
Right. The picture shows Paul bound. Did the scripture say that he was bound?
No.
Do you think he was bound when he spoke in front of the Sanhedrin?
Probably.
Yeah, probably true. Now, this is a different Ananias than the one that healed his eyes. They use so many common names, it's very difficult. Ananias, the high priest, his full name was Ananias ben Nedibus. He served as high priest for 11 years, which was 48 to 59 AD. This would mean that he became high priest as Paul started his first missionary journey. As our story is around 57 AD, Ananias is only 2 more years as high priest. According to Jewish historian Josephus, Ananias was appointed by Herod Agrippa II in approximately 48 AD. He was known for his harshness and cruelty. Although the Bible does not state it, Ananias was probably involved in the plot to murder Paul on his way back to court, which we will discuss in our next chapter. 5 days later, Ananias will travel to Caesarea and continue to pursue his case against Paul before Governor Felix, which is further in our reading. Ananias and the other Jewish leaders considered Paul to be a ringleader of a troublemaking Nazarene sect that was stirring up riots among the Jews. Many of the Jews hated Ananias because of his ruthlessness and corruption, but he was protected by Rome even after he was deposed as high priest. In AD 66, at the start of the first great Jewish revolt, Ananias was assassinated by an angry mob of anti-Roman revolutionaries. So that's who he is.
Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'"
Why did the slapping upset Paul?
Because they violated the law.
Although it is implied in the Old Testament, the best understanding of this comes from John 51. Does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he's been doing? Ananias had not even heard Paul's defense before having him slapped. What was Paul's first 4 words?
God will strike you.
This actually is prophetic, as Ananias will be assassinated. What did those that were standing near Paul say to him after Paul's outcry?
How dare you insult God's high priest?
Why did Paul not realize that Ananias was the high priest? Was the high priest always the leader of the Sanhedrin? Yes, and Paul would have known that. Perhaps Paul could not see well. We know that that's a possibility. As Ananias became high priest after Paul left, so Paul may not have known that there had been a change. Paul is quoting from Exodus 22:28 when he says a person is not to speak evil about the ruler of his people.
Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things.
So Paul decides he's going to use a strategy here. Rather than make his defense, he decides he's going to put them at odds with each other. And he doesn't tell a lie, but he just manipulates this, which his intelligence does that. And actually, how this works, he actually uses this several other times, not how he proceeds, but the fact that they never actually accused him of everything because they didn't hear the defense. So this was actually probably God inspired to some degree. What did Paul say he was on trial for?
Hope of the resurrection of the dead.
Is what Paul said of his accusation true?
Yes.
Yeah, a version of it is true. He's talking about telling that Jesus is the Messiah. That part he's kind of excluded. What do the Sadducees believe that is different from the Pharisees?
No resurrection or angels nor spirits. Pharisee believes this.
Right. It is said, knowing some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, do you think that Paul set this difference of opinion up precisely to cause this conflict?
Yes, difference of opinion.
Yeah, he's pretty smart. And maybe he was God inspired because it ends up being good for him at several scriptures down the road too. So somehow this was a good way of doing it. If your answer to number 4 is yes, why do you think Paul did this rather than defend his belief that Christ was the Messiah?
They wouldn't listen to him.
Right. So he uses a whole different method.
There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?
Some translations add more to the last statement. New King James, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So some translations have that extra verbiage. Was there the serious debate that Paul anticipated?
Yes.
In fighting against the Sadducees, the Pharisees actually defend Paul by saying what?
We find nothing wrong with this man.
Notice the last statement of the Pharisees. This refers to what Paul told the crowd in front of the temple in Acts 22:17. Since Paul has not had a chance to make his defense heard in front of the Sanhedrin, does this mean at least the Pharisees of the Sanhedrin had heard Paul's testimony on the steps of the barracks?
Yes.
What is the phrase some translations add?
Let us not fight against God.
This seems to refer back to what Gamaliel advised the Sanhedrin, Acts 5:38-39. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God.
Okay. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks.
Just how violent was this dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees?
The commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them.
Why was the commander afraid for Paul's safety? Why was Paul so important?
He's a Roman citizen.
Yeah. Did the commander put Paul in jail or in the barracks?
Very.
By the words in the scripture, was the commander with Paul?
No.
Right. How did the commander know that there was a commotion in the Sanhedrin council chambers?
He could hear the commotion.
Right. What has Paul said here and before the crowd who took him from the temple that has caused such violence?
Preaching to the Gentiles.
Right. If we stand strong for Christ, could we expect this type of reaction?
Yeah.
Do you think this is why the Jerusalem church was unopposed, because it would not stand against Paul?
Yes, because church
Yeah.
was fine.
Right. Yeah, they've started to compromise a little bit and not stand strong, which was probably not really the best thing.
The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome."
Paul might have felt discouraged. Even after 25 years, his own Jewish people will not listen to his testimony. Even the Christian church in Jerusalem did not come to his rescue when the crowd attacked him. When did Jesus come to visit Paul?
The following night,
Was it a vision, dream, or do we know?
the Lord stood near Paul.
Yeah, he stood near, so he was, yeah. What did Jesus acknowledge that Paul had done?
He testified about him in Jerusalem.
Despite the Christian church in Jerusalem trying not to make conflict with the Jews, Paul gives his testimony to a crowd of Jews with boldness. Even though he appeared not to make an impact, even though the crowd attempted to kill him when he spoke about Gentiles, does what Jesus say above get an indication that Paul's testimony in Jerusalem might have accomplished something? Or is Jesus just acknowledging what Paul has done and no more?
An accomplishment, something to someone in the crowd.
Right. We have the scriptures that Luke says 137, for no word from God will ever fail. Isaiah 55:11, my word that goes out from my mouth, it will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. This assurance that he will testify in Rome will really help Paul in the days and weeks to come. So we come to the crossword, which is the end of this chapter. A little bit easier crossword, looks like. Number 4, Lord says to Paul, take courage. You have testified of me in
Jerusalem.
So you will in Rome. Number 6, the two ruling parties of the Jews in that day were the Sadducees and the
Pharisees.
Number 7, who was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces in the Sanhedrin?
Commander.
Number 8, what book did Paul quote from when he said not to speak evil of the rulers?
Exodus.
Number 1 down, who is the high priest at this time? Ananias. Yeah, Ananias. Number 2, Ananias ordered Paul to be struck on his
mouth.
Number 3, the Sadducees do not believe in the
resurrection,
nor angels nor spirits. 5, in Acts 23:9, we see that some of the Pharisees were also
teachers
of the law. Yeah. So that's the end of this chapter. Let me go ahead and stop it here.